We were listening in to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs briefing on the key takeaways from the Indian Prime Minister's bilateral meeting with the US President Joe Biden. Also, the Quad summit that was held, a very important first ever in-person Quad meeting that has now concluded. With us on the broadcast to talk more about these developments and those meetings is Lisa Curtis. She's with us from Washington, D.C. Lisa Curtis is the Senior Fellow and the Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Thanks very much, Lisa, for being here with us. Welcome to WION. We were listening in to the remarks made by the Indian Foreign Secretary, highlighting the key issues that were on the table during those meetings that the Indian Prime Minister has held. What is your assessment of the Accord summit priorities at this point, and where do you see this partnership headed, specifically when it comes to countering the Beijing threat?
Well, I think this was a historical day, the first time the four leaders are meeting in person, and they have clearly expanded the agenda. In the meeting in March, they had identified 3 working groups on critical and emerging technologies, climate change, and vaccines. But clearly they've expanded that agenda. They've announced a major education partnership. They've talked about cooperation on 5G technologies in particular. So they have definitely broadened the agenda. They've talked about infrastructure as well. So the issues that they're dealing with are largely economic, technology related, aimed at producing positive public goods for the region. So they have a very positive agenda. But just because, security issues are not talked about or announced, for instance, I think it's clear that they all have security on their mind, and that this grouping is really about competing with China and countering Chinese aggressive behavior. And they're doing that by asserting an agenda for a free, open, and transparent Indo-Pacific, and pushing against any Chinese efforts to promote a more militaristic, authoritarian, or closed region. So it's very important, and it's a very strategic grouping, and it's been a remarkable day. The fact that they have met twice in 7 months, once virtually, once in person, says a lot about where this grouping is going and the long-term vision that the grouping is taking.
Right. And talking about the issue of counterterrorism, which has been India's priority throughout those discussions, in the backdrop of the Afghanistan debacle, for which the United States has been blamed. And it was a messy withdrawal, to say the least. To what extent do you see the statement that's come in on the Quad discussions, on the bilateral that was held between the Prime Minister and the American President? What is the sense that you get of whether or not the United States shares India's seriousness when it comes to tackling the ramifications of the Afghanistan crisis?
Well, I am concerned that the Biden administration may try to turn away from the crisis in Afghanistan. But we simply can't. We've seen what happens when the U.S. Abandons Afghanistan, because that happened in the early 90s, and the result was the 9/11 attacks. So my hope is that Prime Minister Modi was able to prevail on President Biden to make the point that if the United States does not remain engaged, continue to monitor the situation there, we could have reemergence of terrorist threats to the United States from groups like Al-Qaeda, but also terrorist threats to India from groups that have been based in Pakistan, but definitely have links to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda, groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. So both the United States and India, as well as many other countries, would be at threat if terrorist safe haven is allowed to reemerge in that country. So I think that this was a good opportunity to make that point to President Biden, and so that the U.S. will remain engaged, even though the president has made a decision to remove all U.S. troops from the country.
Right, and we also did, during that press briefing that was held, pose a question to the Indian Foreign Secretary about whether or not the Quad would have a military dimension. We did not get a concrete response on that front. What is your assessment of whether or not that is a direction that this alliance could take in time to come?
Well, I think the White House press spokeswoman Jen Psaki was very clear that this is not a military alliance. And so I think the way to look at the Quad, again, is that it's asserting a positive vision for the region. It is strategic in that they're dealing with very strategic issues. The 5G issue, for example, an important emerging technology that the four countries have vowed to work together on. That is very important. The vaccine initiative, that is important right now. And so I think, the point is, even if it's not focused on military issues right now, that it is still a very strategic grouping that does have one eye on the security issues in the region. And by, forming these habits of cooperation and engagement, the four countries would be ready in the event that there was a reason to take on more of a military flavoring. For example, if China was to become much more aggressive with its maritime territorial claims, then perhaps the Quad would feel the need to conduct more exercises or find ways to cooperate militarily. But right now, I think that the message is that these four countries are going to work together. They're going to work together for good in the region. They're going to assert a vision that protects the sovereignty and independence of all the countries in the region. And they're going to offer alternatives. This is important. China, for a while, tried to push the idea that it was the only game in town, that its Belt and Road Initiative was something that all countries needed to sign up to. Well, I think with this infrastructure initiative, the Quad is saying, hey, there are alternatives, and they're better because they're transparent. They will look out for your own sovereignty. They will build up your communities. So this is all very important, and I think it sends a major signal to China that the Quad is working together. They're not afraid to work together. They're not going to be intimidated by Chinese statements, criticizing the Quad, and they're going to have a positive agenda. And so I think this is all very positive.
Indeed. Lisa Curtis, thanks very much for joining us here and sharing those perspectives. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.